We're almost done with the material for the week, and in this lecture, I think we're getting down to some of the finest grained analysis of what good informative speakers are doing, and that is clarity through elaboration, being able to really discuss their details with reference to the larger point in a way that's just elegant and sublime. And so we've been working this week on moving from idea to the outline. And we're almost at the end of this very basic process. So once again, we've sort of gone through coming up with main ideas, breaking it down into smaller ideas, identifying the details that are going to help you discuss that content. And now we're getting to how are you discussing those details in a way that just crystallize that information. Now, we were doing some of this, by the way, back in the impromptu when we were doing state it, explain it, prove it, conclude it, right? I mean, we were talking about here's what the key idea is, let me walk you into it, here's the detail, now let me walk you out. And the informative speech, we're just saying they're going to be more, it's not quite as mechanistic. So we need another tool or another way of understanding or different models for getting at the relationship between big ideas and supporting detail. And so that's what I want to talk about in this lecture. What's going on with elaboration? And by that I mean that term I'm using simply to say you're taking your idea and you're expanding it. You're not just talking about it, but you're elaborating on it. You're expanding our understanding of it. So what's happening in elaboration? And then we're going to analyze a few clips to see this in action, and in terms of very specifically how certain sentences are performing certain functions. So first off, what's going on with this process of elaboration? Well, once again, it's similar in some ways to what you were doing in your impromptu. Basically, you're walking us into and out of the details. You're providing us shells of context. You're saying, here's the idea, let me get more specific. Oh, I've got the smallest bit of detail, and now I'm bringing it back out again so you remember what I'm talking about. So I see this as kind of this hourglass function. Now, this performing this hourglass of moving from broad to narrow back out again, it could be a main point, it could be a subpoint. I just want to say that whenever you need to move from sort of a higher order level of complexity into the details, that you don't just jump straight to the details, and you don't simply sit in the details at the exclusion of the larger point, but that you're finding a way to walk us into and out of the complexities of this information. So in terms of that rubric, this is really what I mean by balancing breadth and depth, context and content. I've got my larger idea, and as a novice with your information, you're helping me figure out where the details sit in relation to that and how these ideas relate to one another. So it's not just that you're talking to me. You're providing me with a map through the information, how the components relate to one another. And I would say in terms of elaboration, excellent speakers make this sound effortless. But there's something going on there. And at some level, this is not too dissimilar to how writing instruction, at least in the U.S., talks about paragraphs. You've got a topic sentence, you've got supporting sentences, and then you've got a concluding line. The only thing we're doing is saying that those supporting sentences are getting more and more narrow and more detailed, and then going back out to that concluding line. And the reason I like thinking about it in this way is because it places most of the emphasis on the idea and makes sure that that detail maintains a supporting role. So what I'd like to do now is take a look at this through a couple of examples. Now, we're going to look at it in terms of the text, the transcript of what is said. But just like last time, at the end of this video, if you're watching this on, I've got the scrolling bars here, if you're watching this on the lesson page for the week, so Lesson 5, Week 5, there'll be an embedded clip of these two speakers, one of which we've already seen before. She was one of the people that we looked at in Week 1, Elizabeth Warren. And then we're also going to be looking at Paul Krugman. And I use both of these. They're both Americans, but I like looking at them both because they're both economists, or at least they're talking about economic issues, and so they sort of serve as an interesting counterbalance to one another. But let's go ahead and take a look at Elizabeth Warren. So she's now a Massachusetts senator, but before that she was a professor of law and gave a number of talks about the banking industry and financial issues. And again, I'm using this as an example of a speaker. Certainly, those of you in the U.S., I don't care one way or the other whether or not you agree with her politically or not. That's not the function of this course, and nor do I want it to be. But I do think there's something to be learned in terms of how she's walking into and out of complex detail. So let's go ahead and take a look at what you'll listen to at the end of this video. So let's go ahead and take a look at this text. So you see on here, I've got distinguishing what I would call sort of the key idea and then the actual details, and then the black text would just be sort of filler lines. Okay, so we've got a couple of filler lines. My prediction should still hold. After all, families are getting richer in the sense of more income over time. What happened? Pause. Savings went down in the same time period. That's a point. That's her claim. That's her subpoint. Then we jump straight to some detail, her evidence. So, the one-income family in 1970 was putting away about 11% of their take-home pay. Then, notice here, she doesn't jump right to the next piece of evidence. She's got a buffer sentence. She's giving us time, and I don't even know if she knows that she's doing this, but she's giving us time to process that. She's elaborating on that evidence. So she says, think about that. Week after week, month after month, they're putting away about 11%. Those 4 sentences don't add much new content to what was in green there. 1970 putting away around 11%. They don't add new content, but I would say they are desperately important when it comes to listening to that speech, because they elaborate, they repeat, they reiterate, they open up that piece of data. But then we're ready for the next one. By the year 2006, you notice that line goes below zero, another buffer line. This is a concept that only Alan Greenspan would love. Back to the details, negative savings. The American family today puts away nothing, buffer, and quite frankly has been putting away nothing for the last 5 or 6 years. There's nothing there. There is no savings. Look at the end of that paragraph and the beginning of that paragraph. That's a subpoint. That right there is a subpoint with detail. And that, I think, is how you do it well. It is weaving together these various levels of meaning, but weaving them together in a way that there's not a hard shift between claim and support. And I won't read you the next one, but you can certainly take a look at it, but you got the same thing going on. A claim or an idea, a key point, some buffer explanation, getting into the nitty-gritty of the evidence, of the details for that point, and then buffer sentencing us out and ending again with a capper. Okay, so I think that is a good example of how this would work. Now let's take a look at somebody else, Paul Krugman. He's no slouch, right? Dude's got a Nobel Prize. I don't think they just hand those out. So he knows what he's talking about. But in this clip, and it's a clip chosen for this very reason, so I'm not saying he never does this, but it serves as a good counter-statement to what we just saw. So let's go ahead and take a look at textually what's going on when he's talking through some financial evidence. All right, so here you've got the evidence. So he's got, just getting back to normal levels of state and local employment relative to population. You can get 1.3 million workers. You can add 1.3 million people to employment right away. So that's a buffer sentence. So we've got our piece of data, but we don't have a driving subpoint. We don't have a key idea to attach that evidence to. Now it kind of makes its own point, but we haven't shelled that detail. It sort of floats out there. He's got some buffer, but he's not dialing back out to the level of key idea. Then we jump again into another piece of hard evidence. You can get $3 billion a year in aid to the economy. That's enough, almost certainly, to get us below 7% on unemployment, to get us into a much, much better economic frame. It's not technically hard, politically hard, no question about it. So I don't really see a whole bunch in that small segment on the sort of the larger claim there. Now, it's not terrible, it's not bad, but I think there's a real difference between how one interacts with that Krugman clip as opposed to that Warren clip. And what I think is happening is in that Krugman clip, it's too truncated. There's just not enough time, there's not enough elaboration on that evidence. It's just, here's a data point, here's a data point. And when I work with a lot of people in business and science and in most fields, they tend to be more on that end. They talk almost exclusively about the details without giving us elaboration, without giving us the sense for what that subpoint is or what the larger idea is. They've got, here a general theme, and then I'm going to just jump and talk through the detail. So I like moving through these two clips, putting them in conversation with each other, because I think it highlights how you can provide context, meaning through elaboration. It's not just about that evidence. It's about walking us into and out of that evidence so that we've got some type of meaning attached to it. And so this matters because, in essence, if it's just the raw data, your audience can get that raw data anywhere, okay? They can go look it up on Wikipedia. We live in an information society. There's almost anything that you're going to speak on, they can probably go find out that same information or get at least your details somewhere else. But what you provide as a speaker is meaning to the information, an interpretation of the information, a read on that information, a sense of context. That's what you're doing as an informative speaker. You're not just providing raw information, you're the filter. I'll often come back to this when I say, in persuasive speaking and informative speaking, you're the argument. It's not you're the performer and your argument's on the page. When you stand up to speak, the audience doesn't see that thing, that page. They see you, okay? So you're the argument. You're the presenter. You're the thing that people are interacting with. So your job is to help us as an audience understand what that information means. You're informing us what the details are and what those details mean for us for the topic. Okay, and that's a big thing. So we've got one more lecture left, and we'll take a look at examining an informative speech and getting some feedback form exposure. But at this point, in terms of what I've been asking you to do this week, you should have a pretty solid outline. We've got main points, subpoints, and details. It's probably gone through a couple of revisions and a couple of run-throughs. I certainly asked you to work on it a couple of times, and you're probably locking down the key content and you're refining. And so this week has been about moving from the idea, the informative idea, coming out of the last week from our goals for the informative speech. It's been moving from idea to this developed outline. And that's a lot of terrain to cover in the span of a week, and it reflects a lot of decisions on your part. And that's good. That's what you should be doing as a speaker, rendering judgments. Remember that William Keith and Christian Lundberg line. Clarity is the result of choices. Every time you're making a change, you're rendering a judgment, you're making a decision. The key thing is that you're driving those decisions towards the goal of clarity for that audience. So, work on your speeches, continue to refine this, continue to develop it, really start doing some run-throughs. Hopefully you're working this up for a speech that you're going to be giving tomorrow. Or even if you're thinking about doing it for this class, you should be practicing it. Next week we're going to get into style and delivery. But at this point, you should have something that you should be working with and running and starting to feel good about.